Picture this: September 2nd, 31 BC. The azure waters of the Ionian Sea, just off the coast of Greece, are about to witness something absolutely extraordinary. Two massive fleets, over 500 warships combined, face each other in what will become one of the most consequential naval battles in human history. On one side, Octavian, the calculating heir of Julius Caesar, Rome's future emperor. On the other, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Rome's greatest general, standing alongside Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt and one of the wealthiest, most powerful women the ancient world has ever known. What's at stake? Nothing less than the fate of the entire Mediterranean world. The future of Rome itself. The dawn of an empire that would shape Western civilization for centuries to come. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. This wasn't just a battle. This was the climactic finale of a 15-year power struggle, a forbidden love affair that scandalized Rome, and a gamble that would either forge an empire or destroy everything. What happened next would change the course of human history forever. Here's what you need to understand. To truly grasp the magnitude of what unfolded at Actium, we need to rewind the clock. We need to go back to March 15th, 44 BC. The Ides of March, when everything changed. When the greatest Roman of them all, Gaius Julius Caesar, was brutally assassinated in the theater of Pompeii, stabbed 23 times by men he called friends, men he called colleagues, men who claimed they were saving the Republic. Caesar's death didn't save anything. Instead, it plunged Rome into absolute chaos. You see, Rome in 44 BC wasn't the gleaming empire of marble and majesty we often imagine. Not yet, anyway. Rome was a republic, technically. A massive, sprawling power that controlled most of the Mediterranean world, yet was governed by a complex system of elected officials, jealous senators, and competing factions that constantly schemed against each other. The Republic was supposed to prevent any one man from gaining too much power, from becoming a king. The Romans absolutely hated the idea of monarchy. They'd overthrown their last king nearly 500 years earlier and swore they'd never bow to another. But here's the thing. By Caesar's time, the Republic wasn't working anymore. It couldn't handle the massive territories Rome had conquered. The system was designed for a city-state, not a Mediterranean superpower. Corruption was rampant. Political violence was common, and military generals, men who commanded loyal legions, held the real power, not the Senate. Caesar had recognized this. He'd accumulated unprecedented authority, declared himself dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. He was preparing to reform everything, to transform Rome into something new. And that's exactly why they killed him. Now, imagine the power vacuum his death created. Imagine the absolute panic, the uncertainty, the desperate scrambling for control. Who would lead Rome now? Who had the legitimacy? Who had the strength? Who had the legions? Enter three men. Three very different men, who would temporarily put aside their ambitions and their mutual suspicion to form what history calls the Second Triumvirate, an official, legally recognized power-sharing arrangement between three of the most powerful men in Rome. First, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a skilled politician and general, but honestly, he was the weakest of the three. He controlled Africa and some Spanish provinces, important but not game-changing. Second, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, his most trusted general, his closest friend. Antony was everything a Roman general should be. Brave, charismatic, beloved by his soldiers, and an absolute beast on the battlefield. He was also prone to excess. He loved wine, women, luxury, and the pleasures of life. But make no mistake, this man was dangerous, capable, and utterly ruthless when he needed to be. Third, Gaius Octavius, better known as Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son. Here's what's absolutely incredible about Octavian. When Caesar was murdered, this kid was only 18 years old. 18. A teenager with a famous name, but no military experience, no political experience, no power base of his own. Nobody took him seriously, nobody except Caesar himself, who had seen something in this quiet, calculating young man and named him his heir. And Octavian, against all odds, he claimed that inheritance. The triumvirate's first order of business was revenge. Caesar's assassins, men like Brutus and Cassius, who'd convinced themselves they were heroes saving Rome from tyranny. They fled east, raising armies. The triumvirate hunted them down. At Philippi, in 42 BC, Antony and Octavian crushed the assassins' forces in 2 brutal battles. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide rather than face capture. Justice was served, or vengeance was taken depending on your perspective. Now came the hard part, dividing the Roman world between themselves. Octavian would control the West, Italy, Gaul, Spain, the Roman heartland, but also restless provinces still recovering from years of civil war. Antony would control the East, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and, crucially, Egypt, the wealthiest, most prosperous, most ancient and cultured part of Rome's domain. The East had resources, trade routes, enormous wealth. It also had something else. Cleopatra. Lepidus got Africa. Spoiler alert, he wouldn't keep it long. Octavian would sideline him by 36 BC, reducing him to irrelevance. 2 became the magic number, but here's the crucial detail. This division was supposed to be temporary, theoretically. Eventually, Rome would need a single leader. Both Antony and Octavian knew this. The question was, which one? But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because what's about to unfold is even more incredible. See, Antony didn't just go east to govern. He went east and fell absolutely, completely, utterly in love with Cleopatra, the 7th of Egypt. Now, let's talk about Cleopatra for a moment, because history hasn't always been fair to her. Popular culture often reduces her to a seductress, a beautiful woman who manipulated powerful Roman men. But that's monumentally unfair. Cleopatra was brilliant, fluent in multiple languages, educated in philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. She was a shrewd politician who'd been navigating treacherous political waters since she was a teenager. She'd already had a relationship with Julius Caesar himself years earlier, securing Egypt's independence and bearing Caesar's only son, Caesarion. When Antony arrived in the East, Cleopatra saw an opportunity. And Antony, he saw a partner worthy of his ambitions. They began one of history's most famous love affairs. But here's what's fascinating about this. It wasn't just romance. It was political alliance. Together, they commanded vast wealth, enormous armies, and the devotion of the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Together, they could challenge anyone, even Rome itself. Which brings us to the core of the conflict. Antony started acting less like a Roman official and more like a Hellenistic king. He adopted Eastern customs. He held court in Alexandria with Cleopatra. In 34 BC, he held what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, a lavish ceremony where he declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and distributed Roman territories to her and her children. He declared Caesarion, Caesar's son with Cleopatra, as Caesar's true heir, directly challenging Octavian's claim. Can you imagine how this looked to Romans back in Italy? Their champion, their greatest general, going native, choosing an Eastern queen over Rome. It looked like betrayal. It looked like Antony was preparing to move the center of Roman power from Rome to Alexandria. It looked like he was preparing to make Cleopatra Empress of Rome. Octavian couldn't have asked for better propaganda. You see, Octavian wasn't the general. Antony was. He wasn't the charismatic leader, he wasn't the brave warrior, but he was something more dangerous. He was a political genius, a master manipulator, a patient, calculating strategist who understood that wars are won in the hearts and minds of citizens before a single sword is drawn. Octavian launched a relentless propaganda campaign against Antony and Cleopatra. He painted Antony as a traitor, bewitched by an Eastern sorceress. He portrayed Cleopatra as an existential threat to Rome, a foreign queen plotting to subjugate the Roman people. He conveniently ignored that Antony was still legally Roman, still officially part of the triumvirate. Instead, he focused all his attacks on Cleopatra. The propaganda worked brilliantly. Roman public opinion turned decisively against Antony. In 32 BC, the Senate, heavily influenced by Octavian, officially declared war. Not on Antony, that would be civil war, which was politically problematic, but on Cleopatra, on Egypt, a foreign enemy. Technically, this wasn't Romans fighting Romans. Technically, this was Rome defending itself against foreign aggression, but everyone knew the truth. This was a civil war. The final civil war. The war that would determine Rome's future. Once and for all, the stage was set, but no one could have predicted what was coming. Trouble was brewing, and both sides knew it. Throughout 32 and early 31 BC, both Antony and Octavian mobilized their forces. This wasn't going to be some minor skirmish or border dispute. This was total war. The winner would rule the Roman world. The loser would be destroyed, erased from history, condemned as a traitor. Antony had significant advantages. His military reputation was impeccable. He'd served brilliantly under Caesar, had crushed the assassins at Philippi, had campaigned successfully in the East. His soldiers loved him, would follow him anywhere. He commanded veteran legions, experienced warriors who'd fought across the known world. Plus, he had Cleopatra's wealth. Egypt was staggeringly rich. The breadbasket of the Mediterranean with centuries of accumulated treasure. Ancient beyond imagining, sophisticated beyond compare. Cleopatra could fund any military operation Antony needed. Money buys ships, supplies, mercenaries, loyalty. And Cleopatra had money to spare. Together, Antony and Cleopatra assembled a massive fleet. Estimates suggest around 500 warships, plus hundreds of merchant vessels for supplies and transport. They had approximately 75,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, a huge army by any standard. Their strategies seemed sound. They'd establish a strong defensive position in Greece, forcing Octavian to come to them across the Adriatic Sea. Naval superiority would allow them to control supply lines, raid Italy's coast, perhaps even blockade Rome itself. Time was on their side. The longer the war dragged on, the more Octavian's support might crumble. You can imagine how confident Antony must have felt. He was the experienced general. He had the larger fleet. He had seemingly endless resources. Octavian was still that teenage upstart, that name without substance. But here's where things get interesting. Octavian had advantages too. Less obvious advantages, but absolutely crucial. First, geography and logistics. Italy was Octavian's base. His supply lines were short and secure. Antony's forces, sitting in Greece, were operating far from their primary base in Egypt. Every supply ship that sailed from Alexandria to Greece had to cross hostile waters. Second, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. If you don't know this name, you should, because Agrippa was one of the most underrated military geniuses in Roman history. Octavian's closest friend since childhood, Agrippa was everything Octavian wasn't. A brilliant admiral, an innovative tactician, an engineer who revolutionized Roman naval warfare. While Octavian provided political leadership and propaganda, Agrippa provided military expertise. Agrippa had already proven himself by defeating Sextus Pompey, another rival, in naval battles off Sicily. He'd invented new ship designs, new tactical formations, new weapons specifically designed for ship-to-ship combat. The man was a strategic genius, and he was entirely loyal to Octavian. Third, momentum and morale. Despite Antony's military reputation, Octavian had successfully painted this conflict as Rome versus a foreign threat. His soldiers weren't fighting fellow Romans. Officially, they were defending Rome from an Egyptian queen and her Roman puppet. That narrative mattered. It gave Octavian's cause legitimacy, purpose, moral clarity. Fourth, unity of command. Octavian's forces had clear leadership. Octavian handled politics and strategy. Agrippa handled military operations. Clean, efficient, no confusion. Antony's command structure? More complicated. Antony was officially in charge, but Cleopatra wasn't just a financial backer. She commanded her own Egyptian fleet, insisted on being involved in strategic decisions, had her own advisors and interests. Some of Antony's Roman officers resented her presence, her influence. Cracks were forming, and that's when everything started to fall apart. In early 31 BC, both fleets maneuvered for position along the western coast of Greece. Antony established his main base at Actium, at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf. It seemed like a strong defensive position, a natural harbor, protected waters, good access to supply routes from Egypt. But Agrippa saw an opportunity. He began systematically capturing islands and coastal positions south of Actium, cutting off Antony's supply routes. One by one, Antony's support bases fell. Suddenly, their protected harbor became a trap. Antony's forces were being slowly starved and isolated. Supplies began running low. Morale started dropping. Disease broke out in the cramped camps. Malaria, dysentery, the normal horrors of ancient warfare. Men deserted, rowing across to Octavian's lines. Even some of Antony's senior officers began defecting, bringing intelligence about Antony's dispositions and plans. By late summer, Antony faced a terrible choice. He could stay at Actium and slowly wither away as supplies dwindled and men deserted. Or he could attempt a breakout. Cleopatra advocated for the naval option. Use the fleet to break through Octavian's blockade, return to Egypt, regroup, and come back stronger. Egypt still had resources. They could rebuild. Some of Antony's officers wanted to abandon the fleet entirely, march inland and fight Octavian's legions in a land battle where Roman military traditions gave them a better chance. Antony hesitated. And here's the shocking truth. That hesitation might have been his fatal mistake. Because while he debated, his position deteriorated further. Finally, he made his decision. They'd attempt a naval breakout. On September 2nd, 31 BC, they'd sail out of the Ambracian Gulf, fight through Octavian's blockade, and escape south to Egypt. It was risky, desperate, but staying put meant slow death. Little did he know. Agrippa was ready, waiting, watching. Each decision brought them closer to the inevitable. The moment of truth had arrived. September 2nd, 31 BC, dawned bright and clear over the Ionian Sea. Perfect sailing weather, perfect fighting weather. Both fleets could see each other clearly across the azure waters off the coast of Actium. Antony's plan was actually quite clever. He'd load his ships with treasure, supplies, and as many troops as practical. Then he'd deploy his fleet as if preparing for battle, drawing out Octavian's forces, but instead of fully committing to battle, he'd use his fleet to punch through Octavian's lines at a weak point, then race south to Egypt before Octavian could react. It wasn't about winning a decisive naval victory. It was about escape, about preserving forces for another day. Cleopatra's squadron, 60 Egyptian ships, would carry the war chest, the treasure that would fund their next campaign. They'd sail behind the main line, then make a run for it once an opening appeared. You can imagine the tension that morning, the creaking of wood as hundreds of warships prepared to launch. The rhythmic splash of oars testing the water, the shouted orders of officers moving up and down the lines, the metallic clinking of armor and weapons, the prayers whispered to Mars, to Neptune, to Isis, to any god who might be listening. Antony had around 230 warships, significantly fewer than the 500 he'd started with. Disease, desertion, and lack of supplies had forced him to burn many ships he couldn't adequately crew. But these were large ships, heavily built quinqueremes and even larger vessels, floating fortresses designed to carry marines, to ram enemy ships, to overwhelm through sheer mass. Octavian, or rather Agrippa, who was actually commanding the fleet, had approximately 400 warships. Smaller, lighter, more maneuverable. Agrippa's ships couldn't match Antony's vessels in a one-on-one ramming contest, but they could outmaneuver them, swarm them, wear them down. Around noon, Antony's fleet emerged from the Ambracian Gulf. The Antonian fleet arranged itself in 3 squadrons. The right wing, commanded by Gaius Sosius, one of Antony's most capable admirals. The center, under Antony's personal command aboard his massive flagship. The left wing, under another experienced officer. Behind them, slightly back, Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron waited for their moment. Across from them, Agrippa had deployed Octavian's fleet in a matching formation. 3 squadrons, arranged in a broad arc, designed to envelop Antony's forces if they fully committed. For hours, they waited. You could hear the clash of steel echoing across the water in anticipation. The wind picked up slightly, filling the sails of both fleets. The sun beat down mercilessly. Men sweated in their armor. Rowers gripped their oars. Archers checked their bowstrings. Marines adjusted their shields. This is absolutely crucial. Antony didn't want a full battle. He wanted an opening, a gap, a moment when he could signal his ships to break through and run. Agrippa understood this. He refused to commit his full force, keeping his ships just out of ram range, watching, waiting for Antony to make the first move. It became a waiting game, a test of nerves. Who would blink first? Finally, around mid-afternoon, Antony had no choice. If they didn't move soon, darkness would fall and the opportunity would be lost. He ordered the attack. The right wing surged forward, Sosius's ships driving toward Agrippa's left. The battle was joined. Roman naval warfare in this period was brutal and bloody. These weren't the sleek triremes of the classical Greek period. These were heavy, ponderous warships designed as floating platforms for marines. The key tactic was ramming, driving your bronze-sheathed prow into the enemy ship's side, holding it below the waterline, sinking it. Or, if ramming didn't work, you'd grapple the enemy ship with hooks and boarding bridges, then send your marines across to fight hand-to-hand on the enemy deck. Agrippa's ships had a crucial advantage: the corvus. Actually, Agrippa had improved on an older Roman design, creating a grappling device that could be fired from a ballista, hooking into enemy ships and reeling them in. Once ships were locked together, Roman marines, the best close-quarters fighters in the ancient world, would swarm across. The battle became a chaotic melee. Ships crashed into each other with splintering, grinding impacts. Wooden hulls shattered. Oars snapped like twigs. Men screamed as they fell into the water, dragged down by their armor. Arrows and javelins filled the air. Fire, the ancient naval weapon of last resort, began spreading from ship to ship. Here's where it gets crazy. While the wings were engaged in this brutal slugfest, Antony saw his opening. In the center, a gap had formed in Octavian's line. Not a huge gap, but enough. Enough for fast ships to break through. Antony signaled Cleopatra. And Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron, 60 ships carrying the treasure, the supplies, the hope for future campaigns, raised their purple sails and ran for the gap. They made it through. Cleopatra's ships broke through Octavian's center and headed south, catching the afternoon wind, racing toward Egypt. Now came the moment that would define Antony forever. The decision that would shape his legend, his reputation, his place in history. His fleet was still fighting. His men were still locked in desperate combat with Octavian's ships. Victory was still possible, or at least an honorable fighting withdrawal. But Antony saw Cleopatra's ships escaping, and he followed. He abandoned his flagship, that massive quinquereme that was meant to inspire his men, and transferred to a smaller, faster vessel. Then he ran. He sailed through the gap, following Cleopatra south, leaving his fleet behind. Can you believe it? The fleet, seeing their commander flee, began to lose heart. Some ships tried to follow Antony through the gap, but by now Agrippa's forces had closed it. Others fought on desperately, hoping for a miracle. Many simply surrendered, their crews unwilling to die for a commander who'd abandoned them. The Battle of Actium was over, not by decisive military victory, but by collapse, by abandonment, by the shattering of morale and purpose. Agrippa's forces captured or sank the majority of Antony's fleet. Estimates suggest around 200 of Antony's 230 ships were lost. Thousands of men died in the water or were captured. But the real test was yet to come. Things were about to get much, much worse. The immediate aftermath of Actium was catastrophic for Antony and Cleopatra. They'd escaped with their lives, with perhaps 40 ships total, and with the treasure Cleopatra's squadron had carried. But they'd lost everything else. The fleet, the army, Antony's land forces, left behind at Actium, surrendered to Octavian within days. The political momentum, the narrative, the voyage back to Alexandria must have been absolutely agonizing. Can you imagine? Antony, Rome's greatest general, fleeing from battle. The man who'd stood beside Caesar, who'd crushed Brutus and Cassius, who'd been feared and respected across the Roman world. Running. Defeated not by superior tactics or overwhelming force, but by his own decision. Ancient sources tell us Antony fell into a deep depression. He isolated himself at the prow of his ship, refusing to speak even to Cleopatra for days. The man was broken. Everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for, gone in a single afternoon. But here's what you need to understand. The battle itself wasn't actually the decisive moment. Actium was a defeat, yes, but not a total annihilation. Antony and Cleopatra still held Egypt. They still had resources. They could theoretically rebuild, recruit new forces, mount a defense. The problem was time, and Octavian wasn't about to give them any. You know what? If you're as fascinated by this incredible story as I am, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps us bring more of these untold stories of empires, battles, and human drama to life. Trust me, the best part is still coming. Now, where were we? Oh, right. The moment that would change everything. After Actium, Octavian moved methodically to consolidate his victory. He couldn't immediately invade Egypt. His forces needed rest, his treasury needed replenishing, and winter was approaching, making Mediterranean sailing dangerous. But he used the time brilliantly. First, he secured Antony's former territories. Province by province, city by city, they declared for Octavian. Why wouldn't they? Antony was a defeated fugitive. Octavian was the winner, the man clearly favored by the gods, or so his propaganda insisted. Second, he neutralized Antony's remaining supporters. Some were pardoned and welcomed into Octavian's camp. Others were eliminated. Octavian could be ruthlessly pragmatic. If you were useful, you lived. If you posed a threat, you didn't. Simple as that. Third, he prepared public opinion. His propaganda machine went into overdrive, painting Actium as a glorious victory of Roman virtue over foreign decadence. He'd saved Rome from Cleopatra's schemes. He'd rescued Antony's misguided soldiers from following their commander into treason. He was Rome's savior, Rome's protector. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra prepared for the inevitable. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, tried diplomacy. She sent messages to Octavian, offering various deals. Perhaps Octavian would allow her to remain as Queen of Egypt, acknowledging Roman supremacy but maintaining Egyptian independence. Perhaps he'd spare her children. Perhaps there was some arrangement that could be made. Octavian's response was coldly calculated. To Cleopatra's envoys, he sent vague, non-committal responses. Maybe terms could be arranged. Maybe. Keep hoping. Keep waiting. Meanwhile, his army was preparing to invade. To Antony, he sent nothing. Antony was irrelevant now, a non-person, already erased from the official narrative. Octavian would deal with Cleopatra because she controlled Egypt's wealth. Antony was just in the way. This is where it gets really heartbreaking. Antony knew it was over. He knew no escape existed, but he was still Roman, still a soldier, still bound by those old traditions of honor and glory. If he couldn't win, he could at least face his end with dignity. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's forces invaded Egypt from two directions, from the west through Libya and from the east through Judea and Syria. A pincer movement closing the trap. Antony gathered what forces he could. A small, makeshift army of Egyptian troops, mercenaries, and remaining loyalists. He marched out to face Octavian's legions. One last battle. One last chance at glory. It was hopeless. Outnumbered, outmatched, abandoned by fortune, Antony's forces were crushed. Many deserted before the battle even began. Why die for a lost cause? Why follow a commander fate had clearly abandoned? Antony retreated to Alexandria. The city would be his final stand. But even that wasn't to be. Octavian's forces approached the city. Antony prepared to defend the walls. But the Egyptian garrison, Cleopatra's own troops, refused to fight. They opened the gates. Octavian marched in unopposed, and that's when Antony received the devastating news that Cleopatra was dead. That she'd killed herself rather than face capture. Except she hadn't. It was a false report, possibly a misunderstanding, possibly Cleopatra's own doing to see how Antony would react. But Antony believed it, and for a Roman noble, defeated in battle, his honor destroyed, his love dead. There was only one honorable course of action. He stabbed himself with his own sword. Incredibly, he botched it. The wound was mortal, but not immediately fatal. He lay bleeding, dying slowly, in agony. Then word reached him. Cleopatra was alive. She'd barricaded herself in her own mausoleum, a fortified tomb she'd been preparing for herself, surrounded by treasure and guarded by loyal servants. Antony was carried to the mausoleum. Cleopatra, afraid that opening the doors would allow Octavian soldiers to rush in, had Antony hauled up through a window by ropes. Can you picture it? The formerly mighty general, dying, bleeding, being pulled up the side of a building like a piece of cargo. He died in Cleopatra's arms, his last moments spent with the woman he'd given up everything for. Whether you see this as romantic tragedy or colossal foolishness probably depends on your perspective. But there's no denying the dramatic power of the moment. Marcus Antonius was dead. One of Rome's greatest generals, Caesar's closest friend, a man who'd been part of the triumvirate that ruled the Roman world. Dead by his own hand, defeated by his former junior partner, abandoned by fortune. But Cleopatra was still alive, still in possession of Egypt's accumulated wealth, still dangerous. Octavian wanted that wealth. Needed it, actually. His legions expected payment. His supporters expected rewards. War is expensive, and victory is even more expensive. The treasures of Egypt would fund Octavian's transformation of Rome. But he also wanted Cleopatra herself. Not as a partner, not as a queen, but as a prize, as a trophy, the ultimate symbol of his victory. He would parade her through Rome in chains during his triumph, displaying the conquered Eastern Queen to the cheering Roman crowds. The propaganda value would be incalculable. Cleopatra knew this. She knew exactly what Octavian planned, and she was absolutely determined not to give him that satisfaction. Negotiations began. Octavian sent emissaries, promising fair treatment. Cleopatra stalled, asked for guarantees, demanded assurances for her children. She was buying time, planning. On August 12th, 30 BC, we know the date because ancient sources recorded it, Cleopatra killed herself. The exact method is debated. The famous story claims she used an asp, an Egyptian cobra, smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figs. The snake's bite would be relatively painless and was associated with Egyptian royalty, a fitting death for a pharaoh. But historians aren't certain about the asp. She might have used poison. Cleopatra was known to have studied toxicology extensively. She might have had a lethal dose prepared long in advance, waiting for this exact moment. What we know for certain is this. When Octavian soldiers finally broke into her chamber, they found Cleopatra dead, dressed in her royal regalia, reclining on a golden couch. 2 of her most loyal handmaidens lay dead beside her, also by poison or snakebite. She'd denied Octavian his triumph. She'd chosen her own fate. She died a queen. Cleopatra VII, last of the Ptolemies, last pharaoh of Egypt, one of the most fascinating, complex, and misunderstood figures in ancient history, was gone. With her died the last flicker of Egyptian independence. Octavian annexed Egypt as his personal property. Not a regular province governed by the Senate, but his own private domain. Rome's breadbasket, funding Rome's future forever. This is it, the moment we've been building to, because here's what absolutely defines the significance of Actium and its aftermath. This wasn't just another battle in Rome's civil wars. This wasn't just another chapter in the power struggles that had plagued the Republic for decades. Actium was the moment the Roman Republic died and the Roman Empire was born. Let me explain what I mean. Octavian is returning to Rome. He's the undisputed master of the Roman world. He controls the legions, all of them. He controls the provinces, all of them. He controls Egypt's wealth. He has no rivals left, no competitors, no threats. After decades of civil war, after all the bloodshed and chaos and instability, Rome finally has a single, unquestioned leader. Now, what does Octavian do with this power? Because this is the critical decision that shapes the next 500 years of Western history. He could declare himself king. He's earned it through military victory. He has the power to enforce it. Many people probably expected him to do exactly that. But remember, Romans absolutely hated the concept of monarchy. Caesar himself had been murdered partly because people feared he wanted to become king. The word rex, king, was political poison in Rome. Octavian was too smart for that, too patient, too calculating. Instead, he did something absolutely brilliant. He gave back power. At least he claimed he was giving back power. In 27 BC, Octavian stood before the Roman Senate and made a theatrical show of returning all his emergency powers to the Senate and the people of Rome. The crisis was over. The civil wars were ended. The Republic was restored. He was just a citizen now, he claimed, ready to retire to private life. The Senate, of course, begged him to stay. They'd been carefully coached. They insisted Rome still needed his leadership. They offered him a package of offices and titles that seemed to restore the Republic, but actually concentrated enormous power in his hands. He accepted reluctantly, or so he claimed. The Senate granted him the title Augustus, meaning revered one or majestic one. Not a legal office, just an honorific. But what an honorific! It carried religious significance, suggested divine favor, elevated him above normal mortals without actually making him king. He became princeps, first citizen. Again, not technically a royal title, just acknowledging he was the most important person in Rome. No different from any other citizen, legally speaking, except completely different in every practical way. He received Imperium Maius, supreme military command over all provinces. He controlled the armies, but as a legal authority granted by the Senate, not as a king's prerogative. He became tribune of the people, giving him the right to propose laws and veto legislation. Traditional republican office, nothing radical here, except he held it for life. Piece by piece, office by office, traditional republican title by traditional republican title. Augustus, as we should now call him, assembled absolute power while maintaining the fiction of republican government. The Senate still met. Magistrates were still elected. Laws were still passed through traditional procedures. The Republic's machinery continued operating, but everyone knew the truth. Augustus held all the real power. His word was law. His will was policy. The Republic was a carefully maintained illusion, a comfortable fiction that allowed Romans to pretend they still lived in the world of their ancestors. And here's what's absolutely incredible. It worked. Augustus ruled for 41 years until his death in 14 AD. 41 years of relative peace and prosperity after a century of civil war and chaos. Historians call it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And it would last for roughly 2 centuries. This is the moment that matters. This is why Actium changed everything. Before Actium, Rome was a republic tearing itself apart through internal conflicts. After Actium, Rome was an empire, disguised as a republic, but an empire nonetheless, that would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries. Before Actium, power in Rome was fragmented, contested, constantly up for grabs through military force. After Actium, power was centralized, stable, hereditary in practice, if not in theory. Before Actium, the very concept of a single ruler was anathema to Roman identity. After Actium, emperors were the new normal, accepted, even celebrated. Actium didn't just determine who would rule Rome, it determined what Rome would become. And what of the losers? What of Antony and Cleopatra's legacy? Augustus moved quickly to erase them from positive memory. Antony was declared a traitor, his statues torn down, his name removed from monuments. His birthday was declared a day of bad luck. The Senate ordered that no member of the Antonian family could ever bear the name Marcus again. His very name was cursed. Cleopatra fared even worse in Roman propaganda. She became the archetypal foreign seductress, the Eastern witch who'd corrupted a good Roman man, the scheming queen who'd nearly destroyed Rome. For centuries afterward, Roman and later Christian writers portrayed her as the embodiment of dangerous female sexuality and foreign treachery. But here's what's fascinating. Augustus spared their children. Most of them, anyway. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, was killed. He was too dangerous to live. As Caesar's biological son, he represented a potential alternative claim to Caesar's legacy. Augustus couldn't allow that. The boy was hunted down and murdered. But Cleopatra's 3 children with Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the younger son Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared. They were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, who was ironically both Octavian's sister and Antony's abandoned Roman wife. Cleopatra Selene eventually married King Juba II of Mauritania and became a queen in her own right. Egyptian royal blood continued, just not in Egypt. As for Egypt itself, it became the personal property of Augustus and his successors. The wealthiest province in the empire, so important that senators were forbidden from even visiting without imperial permission. Egypt's grain fed Rome. Egypt's wealth funded Rome's armies. Egypt, which had been independent for thousands of years, became Rome's prized possession. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy took power in 305 BC, was finished. 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition ended not with Egyptian defeat, but with the death of a Macedonian Greek queen who'd embraced Egyptian identity as her own. You think you know what's coming, but trust me, you don't. Because the real consequence of Actium wasn't just political or military. It was cultural, psychological, civilizational. The victory of Octavian over Antony and Cleopatra was portrayed as, and to a large extent became, the victory of West over East, of Roman discipline over Eastern luxury, of masculine virtue over feminine seduction, of civilization over barbarism. This narrative, this framing, would echo through Western culture for millennia. The image of Cleopatra as dangerous Eastern temptress, that became a standard trope in Western literature and art for 2,000 years. Shakespeare wrote it, Hollywood filmed it. The stereotype persisted. The idea that Rome's destiny was to rule, to bring order, to civilize the world, that became foundational to Western imperial thinking. The Roman Empire became the model for every later European empire. The British Empire explicitly compared itself to Rome. The French Empire did the same. Even the American Republic, supposedly rejecting monarchy, adopted Roman imagery, Roman architecture, Roman political terminology. The Senate, the Capitol, the Eagle Standard, the fascism, the concept of manifest destiny. All echoes of Rome, all ultimately traceable back to Augustus's victory at Actium and his subsequent transformation of Rome into an empire. What happened at Actium didn't just change Rome, it shaped the entire trajectory of Western civilization. In the silence that followed, picture Rome in the years after Actium. After decades of civil war, the city was scarred, weary, traumatized. The social war, Marius versus Sulla, Caesar versus Pompey, the triumvirate versus the assassins, Antony versus Octavian. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but political violence and uncertainty. Now, peace, stability, a single leader who promised order and prosperity. Augustus, and let's be clear, this is the name history knows him by, so we'll use it from here, embarked on an ambitious program to transform Rome from a city of brick into a city of marble. He wasn't just speaking metaphorically. He literally rebuilt Rome. Temples rose across the city. The Forum of Augustus, with its temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, commemorating Augustus's victory over Caesar's assassins. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, celebrating the end of civil war. Public buildings, aqueducts, roads, infrastructure projects that employed thousands and beautified the city. Augustus understood something crucial. Rome needed to look the part. The capital of a world empire couldn't be a jumble of old buildings and narrow streets. It needed grandeur, magnificence, monuments that proclaimed Rome's eternal glory. But the transformation went deeper than architecture. Augustus reformed the military, creating a permanent, professional standing army of 28 legions, about 150,000 soldiers, supplemented by auxiliary forces. These weren't temporary armies raised for specific campaigns and then disbanded. These were career soldiers, paid regularly, promised land grants upon retirement, loyal to the emperor who signed their paychecks. He reformed the administration, creating an imperial bureaucracy to govern the provinces efficiently. No more provincial governors treating their assignments as opportunities for personal enrichment. Well, less of that anyway. Professional administrators, regular audits, accountability to the emperor. He reformed the tax system, making it more regular, more predictable, less prone to abuse. Taxes were still taxes. Nobody loves paying them. But at least there was system and structure now. He reformed social morality, passing laws designed to encourage marriage, childbearing, and traditional Roman family values. These laws were probably the least successful of his reforms. Romans stubbornly refused to behave the way Augustus thought they should. But they revealed Augustus's vision. He wanted to restore what he imagined as old Roman virtue, piety, discipline. Most importantly, he established the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the first time in living memory, the Mediterranean world wasn't convulsed by major wars. Trade flourished, cities prospered, art and literature bloomed. The reign of Augustus would be remembered as a golden age. Writers like Virgil, Horace, Livy, and Ovid produced masterpieces that would influence Western literature forever. Virgil's Aeneid, an epic poem linking Rome's founding to Trojan refugees fleeing the fall of Troy, explicitly celebrated Augustus and his vision of Rome's destiny. What Caesar couldn't have known was, his assassination, meant to save the Republic, actually destroyed it forever. By killing Caesar, the conspirators created the conditions that allowed Augustus to become emperor. If Caesar had lived, if he'd implemented his reforms gradually, who knows? Maybe the Republic could have evolved rather than collapsed. Maybe Rome's transformation could have been less traumatic. Instead, Caesar's death led to civil war, which led to the triumvirate, which led to Actium, which led to the empire. History is funny that way. Actions have consequences, but rarely the ones intended. And what about Antony and Cleopatra? Were they villains, as Augustus's propaganda insisted? Were they tragic heroes, destroyed by love and fate? Were they simply politicians and leaders who backed the wrong horse, who misjudged the political currents, who lost? Probably some combination of all three. Antony was undoubtedly a capable general, a brave soldier, a charismatic leader. He was also prone to excess, poor political judgment, and catastrophic decision-making at crucial moments. His decision to flee Actium, abandoning his fleet, ranks among the most controversial choices in military history. Some historians defend it as pragmatic, preserving forces for another campaign. Others condemn it as cowardice that destroyed his reputation and his cause. Cleopatra was brilliant, politically savvy, determined to preserve Egypt's independence in an age when Rome was swallowing the entire Mediterranean. She allied with Julius Caesar and bore his son. When Caesar died, she allied with Antony. She played the only cards available to her, seeking powerful Roman partners who could guarantee Egypt's security. Did she love Antony? Did he love her? Ancient sources suggest yes, though we can never truly know the hearts of people dead for 2 millennia. But whether their relationship was primarily romantic or primarily political probably misses the point. It was both. Love and power, romance and strategy, personal and political, all intertwined, all reinforcing each other. In the end, they lost. Not necessarily because they were less capable or less virtuous than Augustus, but because Augustus had better political instincts, better propaganda, better lieutenants like Agrippa, better luck, and better timing. Imagine if things had gone differently. Imagine if Antony had won at Actium. What would Rome have looked like? Would Antony and Cleopatra have ruled jointly from Alexandria, transforming Rome into a Hellenistic monarchy explicitly rather than disguising it as Augustus did? Would the center of Roman power have shifted east? Would Egyptian, Greek, and Persian influences have reshaped Roman culture? Would the Roman Empire, as we know it, Latin-speaking, Western-focused, developing into medieval Europe and eventually modern Western civilization, have even existed? Or would we live in a world where Mediterranean civilization remained more Eastern in character, where the boundary between Europe and Asia never hardened the way it did, where cultural development followed completely different paths? We can't know. History doesn't reveal its alternatives. What we do know is this: Actium was the hinge, the pivot point, the moment when one possible future became impossible and another became inevitable. Looking back across the centuries, the Battle of Actium, fought on September 2nd, 31 BC in the waters off western Greece, changed human history. Not because it was the most brilliant military victory. It wasn't. Not because it was the bloodiest battle. Far from it. But because of what it represented and what it set in motion. Actium ended the Roman Republic. a form of government that had lasted nearly 500 years, that had expanded Roman power from a single city-state to master of the Mediterranean, simply ended. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a whimper, with Augustus's careful fiction that nothing fundamental had changed. Actium created the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire, in turn, shaped everything that came after. Western law, government, architecture, engineering, language, literature, military organization, all heavily influenced by Roman models. When medieval Europeans sought to revive learning, they turned to Roman texts. When Renaissance artists sought classical inspiration, they looked to Roman ruins. When Enlightenment thinkers designed new governments, they studied Roman precedents. The United States Capitol building, where the American Congress meets, is modeled on Roman architecture. The word Senate comes from the Roman Senate. The fasces, the bundle of rods that symbolized Roman authority, appears in American government iconography. We use Roman numerals. Our calendar is based on the Roman calendar, reformed by Julius Caesar and further adjusted by later Roman emperors. Many of our months are named after Roman gods and emperors. July for Julius Caesar, August for Augustus himself. Rome never really ended. She transformed, evolved, left legacies that persist to this day. And that empire, that transformation, began at Actium. But let's zoom out even further. What does Actium teach us about power, ambition, leadership, human nature? First, military victory doesn't automatically translate to political success. Antony was arguably the superior general with more military experience and a better combat record than Octavian. But Octavian was the superior politician. He understood narrative, propaganda, symbolism. He knew that winning hearts and minds was as important as winning battles. In our modern world, sound familiar? Military strength alone doesn't determine outcomes. Political skill, strategic communication, coalition building, understanding your audience, these matter just as much, maybe more. Second, timing is everything. Antony and Cleopatra might have succeeded if they'd moved faster, acted more decisively, forced confrontation before Octavian had consolidated his position. Their hesitation, their hope that time was on their side, proved fatal. Octavian seized the initiative and never let go. How many opportunities in life pass by because we wait too long? How many potential successes turn into failures because we hesitate at crucial moments? Third, legacy is written by victors. Augustus's propaganda campaign was so effective that for centuries, historians accepted his version of events. Antony became a traitor seduced by a foreign witch. Cleopatra became a cautionary tale about dangerous female sexuality. Only in recent decades have historians begun seriously reassessing these figures, trying to see past Augustan propaganda to understand who they really were. What narratives do we accept uncritically in our own time? What truths are actually propaganda we've internalized? How would history look if different people had written it? Fourth, even the most powerful people face constraints beyond their control. Antony and Cleopatra were both immensely capable, intelligent, experienced leaders. Yet they lost. Sometimes circumstances, timing, luck, the decisions of others, forces beyond any individual's control, these determine outcomes more than personal ability. It's a humbling thought, but maybe a liberating one too. Success isn't always about being the smartest or working the hardest. Sometimes it's about being in the right place at the right time with the right resources and the right allies. Fifth, personal relationships matter in politics. The alliance between Antony and Cleopatra was both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness. It gave them combined resources and capabilities neither possessed alone, but it also made them vulnerable to propaganda, to accusations of foreign influence, to suspicions about Antony's loyalty to Rome. In modern terms, When leaders' personal lives become political liabilities, when relationships cloud judgment or create conflicts of interest, the results can be catastrophic. Sixth, change is inevitable. The Roman Republic was dying long before Actium. The system couldn't handle the scale of empire Rome had built. Whether Antony or Octavian won, Rome was going to transform into something new. The Republic was a corpse. The only question was, what would emerge from its remains? Sometimes holding on to old systems, old ways of doing things, becomes impossible no matter how much we value tradition. Transformation is painful, but sometimes necessary. The question isn't whether change will happen, but whether we can shape it constructively. And finally, human stories endure longer than empires. Augustus built an empire that lasted centuries. But what do we remember? What do we talk about? What fascinates us 2,000 years later? The human drama, the love story, the tragic choices, the final moments of Antony dying in Cleopatra's arms. Cleopatra choosing death over captivity. The personal dimension of this massive historical event. Because ultimately, history isn't just about battles, treaties, political systems, economic forces. It's about people, their choices, their emotions, their triumphs and failures, their very human struggles with love, ambition, fear, and hope. Antony and Cleopatra lost the war, but won immortality. Augustus won the war, but became what? A name in history books? An important figure, certainly, but not one we remember with the same emotional resonance. Shakespeare wrote a play about Antony and Cleopatra, not about Augustus. Countless books, films, operas, paintings, and poems have explored their story. Why? Because we see ourselves in their humanity, their flaws, their passions, their mistakes. The greatest empire in history rose from Actium's waves, but the greatest story to emerge from those same waves. That's the tale of two people who loved each other, who dared to challenge the world, and who went down together rather than surrender. Which legacy is more powerful? Which one endures more meaningfully in human consciousness? I'll let you decide. So here we are, at the end of this incredible journey through one of history's most pivotal moments, the Battle of Actium. September 2nd, 31 BC. A naval engagement off the coast of Greece that lasted mere hours, but echoed through millennia. When those fleets clashed that September afternoon, when Cleopatra's purple sails caught the wind and fled south, when Antony abandoned his men to follow the woman he loved, when Octavian's forces secured victory through superior tactics, and Antony's collapse. The future of Western civilization hung in the balance. Rome could have become an Eastern empire, ruled from Alexandria, blending Roman organization with Egyptian and Hellenistic traditions. Instead, it remained Western, Roman, Latin-speaking, setting patterns that would influence Europe forever. Democracy, or rather republican government, could have been openly abandoned for explicit monarchy. Instead, Augustus's careful fiction of restored republic that was actually empire created a template for how autocracy could hide behind democratic forms. A template still used today. The Mediterranean could have remained culturally unified, East and West equally valued and integrated. Instead, Actium reinforced a division between Western and Eastern civilization that persists to this day. The idea that West and East are fundamentally different, often opposed. That narrative was strengthened, if not created, by Actium's outcome and Augustus's propaganda. But beyond the grand historical forces, beyond empires and civilizations, there are the human stories. Marcus Antonius, brilliant general and flawed man who lost everything for love, or for poor judgment, depending on your perspective. Cleopatra, brilliant queen and last of the pharaohs, who fought desperately to preserve her kingdom's independence in an age of Roman conquest. Octavian Augustus, patient and ruthless, who built an empire by pretending he hadn't. These were real people. They felt fear, hope, love, ambition, despair. They made choices, lived with consequences, faced their ends with whatever courage or cowardice they could muster. 2,000 years later, we remember them. We tell their stories. We argue about their decisions. We imagine what we would have done in their places. That's the power of history. Not just names and dates and battles, but human drama that transcends time. The ships that fought at Actium are long gone, rotted away to nothing. The soldiers who died there left no trace. The great city of Alexandria, where Antony and Cleopatra made their final stand, is buried under modern buildings or drowned beneath the Mediterranean. Even Rome itself barely resembles the ancient city Augustus built. But the story lives on. And maybe that's the real lesson of Actium. Empires rise and fall. Political systems transform. Military victories fade into historical footnotes. But human stories, stories of love and ambition, triumph and tragedy, brilliant success and devastating failure, these endure forever. The Battle of Actium shaped our world. The story of Actium shaped our imagination. Both legacies matter. Both deserve remembering. So I have to ask you, do you think Antony made the right choice following Cleopatra from the battle? Was it love, cowardice, or strategy? Could their alliance have ever succeeded against Augustus's political genius and propaganda machine? And here's a bigger question. If you had been in Antony's position, military commander, former triumvir, partnered with a foreign queen, would you have fought differently? Would you have abandoned Cleopatra to win Roman support? Would you have committed fully to creating an Eastern empire, openly challenging Roman traditions? What lesson from this ancient battle feels most urgently relevant to our modern world? The danger of propaganda, the importance of timing in politics, the way personal relationships intersect with public duty, the fragility of democratic systems under pressure. And finally, which figure from this story fascinates you most? Augustus, the patient builder who created an empire. Antony, the brilliant general who risked everything for love. Or Cleopatra, the last pharaoh who defied Rome until her final breath. Think about it, because their choices echo down through history into our present moment. Their story, victory and defeat, love and ambition, empire and tragedy, shaped the world we live in today. The Battle of Actium, September 2nd, 31 BC. The day the Republic died and the Empire was born. The day when love, power, and destiny collided on the waters of the Ionian Sea. The day that changed everything.